Hello there, World of Tankers. Welcome to the channel. I'm, of course, your host, Blitz, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about the Tier 10 class as a whole, and are there actually any bad Tier 10 tanks in the game? And if so, what are they, and what should be done to fix them? So, that's pretty much what I'm going to be talking about in today's video. Probably not going to get into any actual gameplay, but I figured, you know what, a lot of people always say that this quote-unquote Tier 10 sucks, and blah, 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 and I thought I'd break down into most of the Tier 10s in the game, if there's any issues with them, and, are there actually any bad Tier 10s in my personal opinion? Because as many of you know, I like a lot of tanks in the game. Some of the people are criticizing me for liking the TVP VTU, but man, do I love that gun. But yeah, in today's video, we're going to be sticking to the Tier 10 class specifically, and asking, are there actually really any bad Tier 10s in the game? Now, many of you know, the worst Tier 10 I would personally rank for me is the FV2 and 7 Badger. It just has a lot of issues going for it, but that doesn't mean it's an awful Tier 10 vehicle. I just find it the worst of the Tier 10s currently in Blitz. Its biggest issue is the fact that even though hull down it can be penned, and the gun's accuracy is kind of lackluster, it's just kind of a lackluster vehicle. And because of that, it makes it very tricky with the poor mobility, the poor side armor, the really easy track links to pen through and track at the same time. It makes it quite an easy opponent to rip apart if you know what you're doing. Now granted, there's people that don't know how to fight a Badger, and if you're one of those people, when a Badger's hulled down, yeah, you're pretty much dead. So the Badger can do a decent job. I've pulled out 6,000, 7,000, even I think an 8,000 once in the Badger. It can be an extremely strong tank at certain times, but at the same scenario, it does have a lot of weaknesses. I do think that it deserves a little bit of a buff, maybe on the accuracy, a little bit on the DPM. However, I still think that it can do a pretty decent job. Another vehicle, a lot of people would say, the T110E4. This vehicle, it's got a good gun, 640 alpha, decent aiming time, decent dispersion. Because of that, it's actually pretty dang deadly. It's an E100, but more mobile, a little bit less armor. It's a T110E5 hull, so the hull is somewhat armored, but yeah, as we know, the E5 hull doesn't get the most bounces, especially from anybody that knows how to shoot it. You usually just shoot in the front track wheel, you can hit the rear track wheel. It's a pretty easy tank to rip apart. However, this vehicle carries a big alpha gun. It's got decent damage per minute at around 2750, and the penetration at 310 on the standard and 390 on the premium is pretty dang impressive. So, yeah, I find it actually pretty fun tank to play. Even though it's not the best for winning, you can't really name any Tier 10 tank destroyer that's the best for winning. If you run a Grill 15, there's not much more you're going to have a chance of winning in a Grill than you will in an E4. In fact, the E4 can at least frontline somewhat where the Grill can't. And that goes to the Grill now. The Grill does have some big issues. First of all, the camouflage, the armor, it's got some big killers. The DPM's great, and a lot of people love the DPM. I do too, granted, but it's got so many issues with the camouflage and the traverse speed. It does have a lot of weaknesses. But again, because it's got so much damage per minute, it's not a bad tank by any means, because it's able to get out those shells and keep punching them out. It's got over 1,000 DPM more than the T110E4. In fact, there's only one Tier 10 vehicle that I feel should not exist at all in the Tier 10 class, and that is the FV2 and 5B183. I've talked to many people on this vehicle, and I completely agree with the end verdict on most of the people, which is, it's just a useless tank. There's one goal in mind for anybody running the 183, and that is to ruin other people's days. Everybody that runs this tank knows that it's not a good vehicle. The 183 is probably one of my worst statistical performing vehicles. It's sitting at 57%. The only other Tier 10 that is not 60+% for me is the Grill. And that's just because I've never really loved the tank. It's never been my playstyle. You'll notice other vehicles are 70%, 72, 68, 68. A lot of my vehicles are easily sitting in the 70% range. And granted, this was my first Tier 10 in the game. I can still tell you, even nowadays, if you're playing this vehicle, you can ask Fatness, you can ask any good player. It's based on luck. You have to rely on your team, and your RNG has to work with you if you want to hit your shells in this tank. And because of that, you know that when you're pulling this vehicle out, even if you're a good enough player that's averaging 70% win rate every single month, this tank you have to put RNG on, because it just, you know that it's not going to win. So you're more playing it to just ruin somebody else's day. And granted, while it can be fun, I find what's the point? It doesn't bring any enjoyment, even to the player that's running it, because they know they're going to lose, and half of their shells are going to miss. So even though they might only hit 1 or 2 Hesh shells, yeah, they're going to do 2,500, and then they'll die and lose, and then their win rate goes down. Yeah, I find the 183 fun, and I've definitely played my fair share of games in it, but over those battles, I can tell you it's really not that spectacular of a tank by any means, and it should have just been replaced with the Badger, and then at least Wargaming probably would have balanced the Badger out, because it would have been a tech tree vehicle, not a collector that they don't care about. So, yeah, it's kind of weird. I will say, though, Wargaming did do a fantastic job balancing out the FE 4005. This is what I like to see on balance, where a vehicle has big weaknesses. This thing's a barn. As many of you know, it's got the big old saying on it for World of Tanks PC. Well, I agree with it. It's a big old barn, but Wargaming gave it spall ironage, which means that pretty much HE is negated on the tank, which is great. So first of all, you can't have your game ruined by big, high explosive shells. Second of all, this tank's got a 1,360 damage clip that's able to rip into enemy opponents, but you have to sit out in the open for a good 6 seconds if you want to take all that damage. So I find this one more balanced because, yeah, it hurts a lot, and if you get somebody out in the open, it really, really hurts. At the same time, it's got so many weaknesses in the clip, it does make up, I think, for a lot of the issues. But again, very hard to get a super high win rate in this vehicle because it is a tank destroyer. I think the biggest killer for tank destroyers was the heavy. Well, it's not it is the biggest killer. It's the heavy tank hit point buff. The biggest issue is now that heavy tanks are sitting at 2650 hit points like the AMX M4, or even on the lower end 2438 like the WZ-111-5A, they still gained about 400 hit points at the least, and a vehicle like the IS-7 gained 600 hit points. And that's a big buff. That's a singular shell from any 150 in the game, which isn't great for any tank destroyer because that means now it's one extra shell every tank destroyer has to fire, and a tank destroyer like the Jagdpanzer, granted it's got a decent chunk of hit points compared to the rest of the tank destroyers, 2,120 isn't going to last that long when an IS-4 is just shooting you every single time you poke. It definitely hurts. Or another vehicle like the Badger. It's got a decent chunk of HP, but at the same time, it's not the most. I feel heavily armored tank destroyers like the Badger, the Jagdpanzer E100, the T110E4, T110E3, these vehicles should easily be sitting at, if they want to buff the heavy tanks, 2,400 hit points. But that's my personal opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I just find that these tank destroyers, and most tank destroyers, like even the Object 268, they just die so quickly because it's only got 1,900 hit points. It's weird, but it's something I stand very strong on, is that the tank destroyer class right now is probably the most useless class in tier 10. They've got good guns, but they really, really struggle in the long run, where if you're running mediums, tank destroyer, or mediums, heavies, and lights, you'll have a much higher average win rate. You can probably take a look at Blitz stars and just check off the tank destroyers, and you'll see your win rate will probably rise quite a bit. So, apart from the 183 and other stuff, do I think there's any actual bad tier 10s in the game? Well, a lot of people would say that the FE4202 needs a change. I don't really think so. I think that while having more turret armor would be good, it would also make the vehicle absolutely overpowered. It's got a Hesh gun that's got very, very cool values going for it. 231 millimeters of Hesh pen for 440 average damage. That's pretty dang sweet, but if you're not a great player, you can always run the 105 Royal Ordnance, which carries heat instead of the Hesh. So it's a trade-off. You know, you can run, if you're not as experienced, you can run the heat gun, which does do really good things. It's got great DPM, it's got good accuracy, this tank is quick, it's got decent hull armor, it's not a bad vehicle at all. You can get out some pretty solid games. A vehicle like the FE-Tune 5B, one of my most hated tier 10 heavies, while it isn't a great vehicle for me personally, you can still get some really good games out in it. I've gotten really good games out. It's got the best tier 10 heavy gun pretty much out there. It's got 3,000 DPM, the dispersion's fantastic, it carries Hesh with 515 average damage. The DPM, everything about the gun is great. And even though the hull armor isn't fantastic, you still can get some very good bounces hull down. The Tune 5B may be a really hard cup of tea to drink, but once you start slurping it and it cools down, it can be a pretty dang good tank. Pretty much every tier 10 in the game, I think, can do a decent job if played correctly. Even some of the worst ones can do a very good job. A good example of this would be like the Object 140. This tank is probably one of the worst tier 10 mediums if you were to look at it from a statistical standpoint. Yeah, it's got good DPM, yeah, it's got good mobility, but it's got such weak armor because it's been left alone for so many years. You can easily butter right through that thing's turret with almost any tier 10 heat shell, but A lot of people love the 140, including myself. And why is that? Because if a smart player takes it down to playstyle, you can use the troll upper plate, you can use the good mobility, and that fantastic DPM with good AP shells, and easily rip enemy opponents apart. Every tank at tier 10 has its place, and every tank at tier 10 actually does a pretty solid job if you know how to play it. And I wanted to say this there for anybody that's trying to say, or whenever they say that a tier 10 vehicle sucks, it's usually not the tier 10 vehicle. And I'm not saying the player sucks either. What I'm trying to say is that if you're struggling in a tier 10 tank, watch reviews on it. Watch on how to play it better. Now, the 183... I can't really say that one. Well, as I said before, the 183 I really can't give advice on. I just find it a useless tank that you're really only playing to ruin somebody else's day. But even the VK72, which is one of the worst tier 10 heavies, can still get out some really good games, and I personally enjoy playing the vehicle sometimes more than the E100. It's got great alpha, pretty strong frontal armor, and it's got good gun depression with very strong turrets. So all the vehicles in the game are pretty well balanced at tier 10. There are a couple that break the balance at the lower spectrum and the higher, but overall, there's really nothing wrong. The lowest win rate vehicle at tier 10, the only vehicle lower than a 50% win rate is the 183. Everything else, way above 50%. So hopefully, all of you enjoyed today's video. If you want to see more like it, please consider smashing that subscribe button down below. But I wanted to voice my personal opinion on tier 10 class as a whole. What needs to be changed, and yeah, there really isn't much I find. There are a lot of things that I personally would change, you know, buffing certain vehicles, nerfing certain tanks to kind of even out everything, but that's for a different story. If you want to hear my personal opinions on what should be buffed and changed in World of Tanks Blitz, let me know in the comments down below. But hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you agree with me, please let me know in the comments down below. But the main takeaway from today's video is that really there's no bad tank at tier 10, and there's not really any bad tank in the game. There are a couple bad vehicles, of course, like the Vindicator, the Churchill gun carrier. I could name a whole handful of vehicles that I wouldn't even give to my greatest enemies in Blitz. However, overall, and for the most part, vehicles tier 8, 9, 10, most of them aren't bad, and it's down to player skill. If you know how to run the tank, and you've researched about it, or you just know how the playstyle is, you'll do decent. And saying that a tank isn't good, just because you're not performing well in it, doesn't really mean anything. Try the tank, see how it plays, before just putting a title on it and saying this tank sucks. Because a lot of people were trying to argue with me that the TVP V2 is a bad tank, which is the tier 8, I think it's the Czechoslovakian, if I'm 100% correct here. It is. Now, this vehicle, yeah, well, it's got very poor frontal armor, and it's not the prettiest looking vehicle. It's got 6 degrees of gun depression, which is enough to work most ridge lines, and the gun has got fantastic dispersion, fantastic everything going for it. It's just one of the best guns in the game, and because of that, I'm averaging 3,600 damage for the 4 games I've played in it. I'm personally liking the tank. A lot of people have been struggling in it, but that's not much I can say because, for my personal opinion, it's a pretty dang good tank. So hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. If you want to see more like it, please consider smashing that subscribe button down below. But other than that, hopefully all of you are doing well out there. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye.